All right, so this is the second of the lectures having to do with fragmentations with Lutheranism. And today we're going to be talking about Calvinism, a new faith that is started by another Swiss gentleman during this time period. Now, as important as the Zwinglian Anabaptists and the English Reformers may have been, it was Calvinism that would have the most profound and revolutionary impact on Western civilization. Now, although the Calvinists' primary concerns were religious, the reforms would radically alter the political and economic institutions of Europe, helping lie the foundations for the eventual triumph of both capitalism and democracy. Okay, so these two things, capitalism and democracy, come out of this new break with Christianity. Now, Luther's break with the church was especially difficult since he had grown up without any religious alternatives to Catholicism. For examples to follow in his reforms, and the next generation of reformers, led by John Calvin, grew up in a world that offered alternatives to Catholicism, thus making it easier to break with the church and carry religious reforms much farther than Luther ever had. Now, Calvin himself grew up in France as the first shock waves of the Reformation rocked Europe. Although not officially allowed in France, Protestant ideas still filtered across the border and won converts. Now, unlike Luther, whose tormented soul provides fascinating reading, Calvin was a much calmer individual, and he seems to have been plagued by none of Luther's self-doubts, and his personal character was described as nearly flawless. Now, after receiving a good education in theology, law, and also humanist studies, which prompted him to read the Bible more carefully, he seems to have arrived at some sort of conversion in or around 1533. So let's take a look at Calvin's religion. So the cornerstone of Calvin's theology was God's all-encompassing power and knowledge, and there was nothing that God did not know or have control of. So one of these things, we call this an omnipotent God. So he knows everything, the future, the present, the past, and as a result, God knew and controlled from the beginning of time whose souls would be saved or condemned for eternity. And this doctrine is known as predestination, because you're predestination. Oops. Let's fix this. Predestination. Okay. This is the idea that it had scriptural support and was a logical outgrowth of what Luther had said about faith and salvation being a free gift of God. Now, predestination raised several disturbing questions. First of all, if God were all-powerful, could we have any free will in choosing between God and Satan? So is there free will? This is a very important question in Christianity. Is there free will? This predestination kind of seems like that's taken away. Quite bluntly, Calvin said no. So no free will, according to Calvin. Second, if God were good, how could he let evil exist in the world? So why is there evil? If God is good, why does evil exist? It's another very important question. Calvin answered that these were mysteries of God that we cannot know the answers to and probably have no business asking. So no reason to ask. Finally, can we know we are saved or not? So who is saved? So who is saved is the question that we can always ask ourselves. Now, according to Calvin, there's no way for us to know for sure. However, if we meet the requirements of living an upright life, profession of faith, and participation in the sacraments, we could become pleasing to God and be saved despite our sinful nature, if predestined to do so. Now, such a Puritan lifestyle might not ensure salvation, but it could be a sign that one might be one of the new elected by God to go to heaven. However, Calvin said our primary concern should not be going to heaven, but rather carrying out God's plan for us in this life. Now, as fatalistic as Calvinism, with its denial of existence of free will, may sound, its adherents felt empowered by this idea that they were the special instruments for carrying out God's plan. And this gave them an unshakable faith in the utter rightness of their cause and made Calvinism the most dynamic movement of the day. Now, Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is this book right up here, which was published in 1559. So published in 1559. Dealt with, became one of the most popular and influential books of its day. However, Calvin went beyond words in trying to make a point about his religion, and to ensure that as many people as possible had a chance to be saved, he established a model church and community in Geneva, Switzerland. So once again, instead of in Zurich, where Zwingli was located, he decides to make a model town in Geneva, Switzerland, to enforce the proper lifestyle needed for salvation. Now, naturally, Calvin's reforms met resistance, and it took him nearly 20 years to get control of Geneva and reform it. So here we have a map of Switzerland, similar to that one we saw earlier. Now, although the city in Geneva is located, we have a better picture here. Let's find Geneva on this map. There's Freiburg, Ghent. Geneva's right on the border. I'll find it in a minute here. But in the meantime, although the city government still function, the consistory, we call this is the church council, the consistory. About 12 elders. We had 12 elders in this thing. So the city councils still ran and still function, but we had these 12 elders running the consistory. They wielded the real power over people's lives in Geneva. All citizens were members of the church and had to attend services 3 or 4 times a week. This was because there was no telling who was predestined to be saved, and so all must be given a chance. Now, such acts as fighting and swearing and drunkenness, gambling, card playing, and dancing were allowed. Even loud noises and laughing in church were fined. Theaters and taverns were closed and replaced by inns, allowing moderate drinking, accompanied by sermons and church propaganda. Members of the consistory would make annual inspections of homes to ensure they were morally run. People were even expected to report their neighbors for any behavior that was less than saintly. Now, the consistory also ruled the more trivial aspects of people's lives. Jewelry and lace were frowned upon. The color of clothing was regulated by law, and women were fined for arranging their hair to immodest heights. Children were to be named after Old Testament figures, and one man was jailed for 4 days for naming his son Claude instead of Abraham. Now, punishments were equally harsh, with 58 executions between 1542 and 1564, mostly for heresy, especially Catholicism, and witchcraft. Now, 14 witches were burned in 1 year, and one boy was beheaded for striking his parents. Now, not surprisingly, Geneva was called a city of the saints. Now, Geneva served as a model to other reformers in Europe, helping make Calvinism the most popular form of Protestantism in the Netherlands, Scotland, and even England. And this was in spite of its lack of support from rulers who feared both Calvinism's emphasis on God's absolute power, which might undercut the doctrine of the divine right of kings, and its lack of being associated with any particular nation. Now, in Germany and Scandinavia, Lutheranism was quickly identified with strong nationalist sentiments that rulers could exploit for their own political purposes. However, Calvinism had no particular national ties, thus depriving it of the strong state support that Lutheranism enjoyed. However, the lack of state support forced Calvinists to form independent local congregations. So instead of a big church, they have congregations that were formed, independent congregations, which could lead to some problems down the road, but for the most part stayed pretty unified. So independent congregations making it virtually impossible to uproot and destroy their movement by concentrating on a few leaders. Now, these congregations were somewhat democratic, thus inspiring greater loyalty in all their members, even when facing intense persecution for their beliefs. Okay, so 2 of Calvin's ideas would have far-reaching effects going far beyond religion. First, the idea of predestination. meant not only that Calvinist merchants were allowed to do business and make money, they were predestined to do so, and to do so fervently at God's will. Now, of course, as devout Calvinists, they were to make money for the good of the church and community, and at first that was what they did. However, later generations, lacking the intense fervor of the first generation of reformers, came to feel justified in pursuing profits for their own personal gain. Now, the result of this was the triumph of capitalism. In other words, it became okay to keep your stuff and raise and become more individualistic with your money. And this became very popular in both England, where there were a lot of Calvinists, as well as in the Dutch Republic. Okay, and if we look at this map over here to the left, we have England up here, and we can see the Calvinists Calvinist influence were in the kind of the shaded area, so down in this area. But eventually, the ideas of especially capitalism spread to up here in that's Denmark, up here in the Netherlands, as well as over here in England. But that's capitalism. But notice the majority of Calvinists were centered down here in France and then parts of Switzerland as well. Now, aside from this, the result, besides England and the Dutch Republic becoming so Calvinist predominated, it also became the economic system that was predominant in these areas as well. And in turn, Western Europe became the economic center of the world and home of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the second Calvinist far-reaching effect of Calvinism was the concept of God's absolute power, that along with the idea that God sees all useful occupations as equal. So all occupations equal. I mean, this was similar to what Luther said as well, but Calvinism extended this even further. Equal, make that an A there. Extended this even further. Now, Calvin himself preached obedience to authority, unless religious conviction forced civil disobedience, but it should never involve open resistance, since God alone would punish any evil rulers. However, some Calvinists, such as John Knox, the fiery leader of the Scottish Calvinists, so this is John Knox, Knox, John Knox, preached people could overthrow a corrupt prince to defend their religious beliefs and God's law. And then the revolt of the Spanish Netherlands and the English Civil War were two prime examples of such Calvinist religious revolts. Now, later, these two ideas, and I'll put here all occupations are equal, and religious revolutions as well, were very common eventually with some of these leaders. But both of these things, both capitalism and religious revolutions, combined into even more powerful an idea discussed by John Locke's two treatises on government. Much as middle-class contracts define obligations in a business deal, John Locke, I'll write his name down here for you to, we'll talk about him later when we talk about capitalism. John Locke saw government as an implied contract, especially defining obligations for the king, who acted as caretaker of the state for the good of the people, protecting their lives, liberties, and property. Now, if the king failed in these duties, the contract was null and void, and the people had the right to overthrow him. Now, this combination of middle-class contracts and the belief in religious revolution would become the cornerstone of democracy, and within that idea lay the seeds for the democratic revolutions that would sweep through France, Europe, and eventually the entire globe in the 1800s and 1900s.